She was only 14 years old, fragile, sick, living in a damp cave between hunger and forgetfulness. But it was there that heaven descended. Saint Bernadette knelt before the stones when an intense light appeared among the dry branches. And in the midst of it, a lady appeared, beautiful, with a white veil and a rosary between her fingers. It was Mary, the Mother of God. But when Bernadette told, they laughed at her. They called her crazy, a liar, possessed. Even so, she returned, day after day, and the lady continued to appear, until one day the earth trembled and water sprang forth from where there had only been dry stone. A spring of healings, of miracles. She never asked for glory. They didn't believe her at first. But heaven had chosen that girl for an eternal mission. You will now understand why Saint Bernadette was humiliated on earth, but exalted by heaven itself. Chapter 1. A poor childhood in Lourdes. In the small town of Lourdes, nestled among the cold green valleys of the French Pyrenees, the winter of 1844 arrived silently, bringing with it a biting cold that penetrated to the bones. It was there, on January 7th, that a child came into the world in a modest house known as the Bolly Mill. Her name would be Bernadette Soubirous, the firstborn daughter of François Soubirous, an honest but impoverished miller, and Louise Castereau, a washerwoman exhausted by the pains of life. Bernadette's childhood was not marked by toys or parties, but by the smell of damp flour, the rhythmic sound of the stream's water turning the mill, and the family's constant struggle to put bread on the table. It was a house of open doors and hopeful hearts, but with empty stomachs more often than not. From an early age, Bernadette displayed a sweetness that contrasted with her fragile health. She suffered from chronic asthma, and constant fits of colitis had robbed her of strength she would never fully regain. Her voice was soft, her gaze deep, and even amid misery, she exuded a peace that disarmed. Still, the little girl knew well the pain of being overlooked. At 10 years old, she couldn't read or write, and was considered slow by some more critical neighbors. But her soul was sensitive to what ordinary eyes could not see. The family's situation worsened in 1854 when the mill was shut down due to debts and bad luck. With calloused hands and heavy hearts, the Soubirous family was forced to move to an old, decommissioned prison, a dark, damp, insect-infested cell known to the locals as the cachot. It was a space of only 10 square meters, without ventilation and with a permanent smell of mold and misery. There they slept, ate and prayed. There Bernadette would begin to learn what it meant to carry the cross silently. Despite the grim setting, it was on Bernadette's face that a serene light could be seen. She continued to help her mother. With her younger siblings, fetched water from the village well, tended sheep, and did small jobs to earn a few cents. On Sundays, she went to the church of St. Mary, where she always sat in the back pews, with her hands crossed and her eyes closed. She did not fully understand the catechism, but she felt deeply what she could not explain. Many times, on her way back from Mass, her gaze would wander to the tops of the mountains surrounding Lourdes. The cold wind would hit her face, and even in silence, her heart seemed in constant prayer. She was a girl of few gestures, but of intense devotion. In her soul, something was preparing, like the sky darkening before a miracle. At the end of 1857, at 13 years old, she was sent by her parents to work as a servant in the house of a peasant on the outskirts of Lourdes. The goal was simple, to ensure food and a roof, but the separation from her family was painful. She slept in a cold barn, ate leftovers, and was treated roughly. Even so, she never complained. She carried a small rosary with her, and every night she would clutch it between her fingers before sleeping, whispering prayers to the Virgin. Just before turning 14, she returned home. She was thinner, with sunken eyes, but with a new brightness. It was as if some silent promise had settled in her spirit. Poverty remained, and so did the pains, but something in her had changed. She was firmer, more ready, as if God were shaping her in the furnace of humiliation and hope. She did not yet know, but in a few days, something supernatural would tear the veil of routine. Lourdes would never be the same, and that girl invisible to the world, a resident of a dungeon, would become the messenger of a heavenly queen. Chapter 2. The first apparition in the grotto of Massabielle. It was February 11th, 1858. The morning in Lourdes began grey and cold. The wind blew firmly over the colourless fields, and the stones on the ground exuded the moisture of winter. Bernadette, then 14 years old, walked carefully alongside her sister Toinette and a friend, Jean Abadi. The three were searching for dry firewood along the banks of the small Gave River, near the rock of Massabielle, an area known to the locals but seldom visited. The cold bit at their skin, and their hands were swollen and red. Poverty did not allow for choosing the best days to work. As her companions crossed the stream, Bernadette hesitated. The water was icy, and her fragile body resisted the crossing. She sat on a stone, trying to delicately remove her socks and shoes, feeling the roughness of the ground and the pain in her fingers. It was then that a strange gust of wind, without shaking the surrounding trees, passed over her body. A different silence took over the scene. Everything seemed to stop. Raising her gaze to the dark grotto of Massabielle, her eyes fixed on something that escaped reality. An intense light, golden and soft at the same time, emanated from a hollow in the rock. Inside it, a feminine figure, dressed in radiant white, with a veil covering her head and a rosary hanging from her intertwined hands, gazed at Bernadette with a look of love that was impossible to describe. She stood still. Her heart raced, but her body did not tremble. She felt a peace as deep as her astonishment. Automatically, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the rosary. She began to pray. The lady did the same, except that while Bernadette moved her lips, the figure remained silent, following the beads with her fingers. It was a moment outside of time. The scent that wafted from the grotto was not of earth or mold, but a light floral perfume, like lilies wet with dew. Bernadette, even in ecstasy, remained humble. When the prayer ended, the light began to fade, and with it the celestial figure. Without words, without dramatic gestures, just a gentle goodbye that faded with the breeze. Toinette and Jean returned and found Bernadette mute, pale, with a distant look. "Did you see something?" they asked. She responded with a vague nod and tear-filled eyes. She could not explain. Later, upon arriving at the cachot, she told her mother what had happened, who reacted harshly. She forbade her daughter from returning to the site, considering it all the imagination of a sick girl. But something in Bernadette would not allow silence. There was an inner strength within her that had been unknown until then. She asked her father for permission, and after insisting, returned to the grotto 2 days later, on February 14th. The lady appeared again, now with a slight smile, and once again, she did not say a single word. She simply looked. In the third encounter, which took place on February 18th, the lady finally spoke. Her voice was low, sweet as a murmur of flowing water, firm as a mother's command. She asked Bernadette to return to the grotto for 15 consecutive days. She did not promise joys or ease, but assured, "I do not promise to make you happy in this world, but in the next." These words pierced Bernadette like a sword of light. She knew her path was set. She did not seek miracles, nor did she understand the plans of heaven, but she felt called by a greater love. With each return to the grotto, something new was revealed. not only in the apparition but within herself. It was as if the girl from the cachot was being molded by invisible hands, purified by poverty, educated by pain, and now guided by a presence that illuminated everything. And so, with humble steps and a steady heart, Bernadette began her silent way of the cross. The news began to spread, and the gazes of the town, sometimes incredulous, sometimes hostile, began to turn toward that frail teenager who claimed to see the Virgin Mary on the cold stone of Massabielle. But it was only the beginning. The storm would come, as would the judgments. Heaven had torn the veil of the world, and Bernadette would be its door, its silent messenger. And the world, still blind, would begin to hear rumors of the supernatural coming from a girl too poor to lie and too pure to doubt. Chapter 3. The apparitions repeat and provoke unrest. The mornings in Lourdes no longer seemed like they used. Since the third apparition, the rock of Massabielle ceased to be just a stone formation ignored by passers-by and became the epicenter of something that many called a miracle, and others, delusion. In the following days, Bernadette faithfully returned to the grotto. The simple clothes, bare feet, and downcast eyes contrasted with the intensity of what she was experiencing. Every day, more and more curious people gathered to accompany her. They were peasants, mothers with children in their arms, sick people on crutches, skeptical soldiers, young and old women who carried rosaries between their fingers and hope in their hearts. Between February 19th and 23, 1858, the lady appeared in silence, but with an increasingly strong presence. Bernadette's face during the visions took on a serenity that captivated and unsettled. She entered a state of peace that seemed to suspend time. "She looks at me as if I were someone," she would say upon coming out of the trance. However, this heavenly peace caused earthly discomfort. The local authorities, led by Commissioner Jacomet and regional doctors, began to interrogate Bernadette harshly. They would sit her in cold rooms, ask her tricky questions, and try to make her fall into contradictions. But the girl always maintained the same answers, simple, clear, and firm. "I saw a lady. She smiled. She asked me to come back. She does, not deceive me. And when pressed, I do not know her name." On February 24th, the lady, who had remained mostly silent until then, spoke with strong words. "Penitence, penitence, penitence, pray to God for sinners." This phrase, heard with a gentle pain by Bernadette, broke the hearts of many present. She repeated the words with tears in her eyes, kneeling on the hard ground of the grotto, arms open as if in a cross. It was as if there humanity was called to conversion, not out of fear but out of love. The air seemed to carry a different weight, not of oppression but of spiritual urgency. The next day, February 25th, the tension increased. The lady asked Bernadette to drink from the spring and wash herself in it. Confused, the girl looked around. There was no spring. The lady pointed to a spot on the ground, next to the rock wall. Bernadette began to dig with her bare hands. The earth was dark, mixed with roots and stones. Her nails bled, and the crowd watched in silence, some with irony. Mud emerged, murky, and Bernadette, obedient, drank from that dirty water and rubbed it on her face. People laughed. They called her crazy, filthy, hysterical, but she stood firm. Minutes later, from the same hole where the mud flowed, a stream of crystal-clear water began to flow. Would this be the spring that would bless millions in the centuries to come? The crowd grew larger each day. The newspapers began to report the phenomenon. Some called Bernadette a saint, others a liar. The government pressured the clergy. The clergy hesitated to support, and Bernadette, she continued her mission. With wounded feet, simple clothing, and her gaze fixed on the lady, she fulfilled the 15 days promised. In the apparition of March 2nd, the lady asked for something unexpected. Tell the priests to build a chapel here and for a procession to take place." Bernadette was frightened. How could an uneducated peasant dare to give orders to Pastor Peramele? Yet she obeyed. With the rosary in her hands, she went to the parish house. The priest received her coldly. "Who is this lady? Ask her name. How can I build a church without knowing who speaks through her?" he shouted. Bernadette stepped back, but promised to ask. In the last apparition of the 15 days, on March 4th, the lady appeared again but did not say her name. The people, frustrated, began to doubt, but Bernadette remained faithful. She knew that the words of heaven do not follow the time of men. With each return to the grotto, the pressure increased. The police wanted to close the site. They blocked the entrance with fences and threatened Bernadette's parents, but the people began to tear down the barriers, light candles in secret, and keep watch at night to ensure that no one would prevent the grace. And Bernadette, in the eye of the storm, was the calmest of all. She asked for nothing. She demanded no faith. She merely spoke of what she saw. And she accepted insults with the same peace with which she received smiles. In a France marked by rationalism and religious persecution, a frail teenager became the channel between the invisible and the visible. Lourdes ceased to be just a village. It became a land of promises and spiritual battles. Heaven had spoken, and the world, astonished, began to listen. Chapter 4. The Secret, the Miraculous Spring, and the Message of Penance. That timid spring that had emerged from the earth turned by a girl's hands was no longer just a trickle of water. At first, it was murky and hesitant, but as days went by, it cleared up, gaining strength and persistence. The first to drink from. It did so out of curiosity, but soon rumors of inexplicable healings began to spread. A paralyzed person walked again. A woman with partial blindness regained her sight. A baby given up on by the doctor began to breathe vigorously again. Bernadette, however, did not boast of any of this. She stated firmly and simply, "The water does nothing. It is faith that heals." She returned to the grotto in silence, day after day, always with the rosary in her hands. The cold persisted, the winds blew fiercely, and yet there she was, kneeling on sharp stones, often with bare feet and bleeding knees. Penance was a language that Bernadette understood without needing it to be explained. When the lady asked for sacrifice, she responded with obedience. She tore apart pride with silence and offered her fragile body as a living gift. On March 25, 1858, the feast of the Annunciation of the Lord, something extraordinary happened. Bernadette had been instructed by Pastor Peramele to ask the lady to tell her who she was. 4 times, with a sweet and humble voice, the girl asked, "Lady, please, would you kindly tell me your name?" The lady smiled but did not respond. On the 5th attempt, a deep silence enveloped the grotto. The wind stopped. The leaves did not move. The sky seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a sparkle in her eyes and hands joined over her heart, the lady opened her lips and said with a serene and firm voice, "I am the Immaculate Conception." Bernadette, not fully understanding what that meant, repeated the words several times on her way back, fearing she would forget them. The pronunciation sounded strange to her, as she barely knew the basics of the doctrine. She arrived breathless at the parish house, knocked on the door, and with her cheeks flushed from the cold and emotion, looked into the priest's eyes. She said, "I am the Immaculate Conception." Pastor Peramele stood still. The words hit him like thunder. The doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, which states that Mary was conceived without original sin, had been proclaimed as dogma only 4 years earlier, in 1854, a truth still unknown to most simple people, and certainly to an illiterate girl like Bernadette. The priest's heart tightened, tears welled up in his eyes, There before him was the confirmation that so many had awaited. The Lady of the Grotto was the very Mother of God, coming to visit the earth not in palaces or monasteries, but in a cold cave, through a child rejected by the world. After this announcement, the entire city began to divide more intensely. On one side, the faithful and devotees, who saw Bernadette as a messenger from heaven. On the other, the skeptics and authorities who feared popular fervor and saw the apparitions as a threat to order. The spring, which now gushed abundantly, was fenced off. They tried to close the grotto. They prohibited processions, but faith would not be cornered. Mothers took their children there at night, lit candles in secret, dipped cloths in the water in hopes of healings, and Bernadette continued her Via Dolorosa. While the crowd sought miracles, she was increasingly persecuted. Interrogations resumed, now with more severity. They wanted her to deny everything. She, with firmness and humility, said, "I am not here to convince anyone. I am here because I saw." Following the revelation of the Immaculate Conception, the apparitions ceased. The lady did not return. The last visit happened in early July, without announcement, without farewells. Bernadette felt in a thick and moving silence that her mission at the grotto had come to an end. However, she felt a longing. Sometimes she walked alone to Massabielle, and there, in silence on her knees, she simply cried. Not out of sadness, but out of a sweet emptiness, like someone who loves deeply and has been visited by a love that can only be understood with the eyes of the soul. That poor girl, the miller's daughter, marked by illness and disdain, had been chosen to bring into the world a source of mercy. The spring was gushing. The name of the lady had been revealed, and the world was finally beginning to kneel before the mystery that flowed between cold stones and hearts warmed by faith. Chapter 5. The public judgment and Bernadette's silence. The visions had ceased, but the world's gaze on Bernadette had not. For many, she had become an icon of faith. For the authorities and part of the clergy, she was still an uncomfortable figure, a poor, uneducated girl who attracted crowds, challenged orders, and above all, remained unwavering in her simplicity. What to do with someone like that? With the end of the apparitions, the more severe interrogations began. Commissioner Jacomet, visibly irritated by the young girl's growing influence, summoned her several times. The tone was cold, legal, inquisitorial. Bernadette entered the stone rooms of the municipal offices, dressed modestly and looking down, sitting on hard wooden benches under the gaze of impatient, suited men. Questions came in succession. Are you lying? Did any priest teach you to say these things? Who paid you for this? The girl, without raising her voice or showing anger, replied, I only said what I saw. As her figure gained notoriety, caricatures appeared in newspapers, public mockery ensued, and even among the faithful there was a subtle distancing. It was as if the world wanted Bernadette to be something more, a saint with powers, a public heroine, a militant martyr. But she remained what she was, a small, silent, obedient servant. The weight of forced fame began to bear down on her. Certain ladies in town tried to offer her better clothes, etiquette lessons, good manners, as if they were shaping a marketable image of the seer of Lourdes. But Bernadette refused everything. She did not want luxury or to be a celebrity of the procession. One day, when asked why she did not touch the coins that the faithful left in the grotto, she replied firmly, "The Virgin did not send me to receive money. She sent me to do penance." Madame, at the school of the Sisters of Charity, where she was taken to try to learn to read and write, she was viewed with suspicion by some of the nuns. They considered her undisciplined, sometimes rude, slow to grasp lessons. Many did not believe that she was chosen by God, but Bernadette endured everything in silence. She knew that her mission was not to please, but to obey. And then came the illness, a bone tuberculosis that slowly began to consume her strength. Her bones were inflamed, her muscles ached, and the fever rose at night. Even so, she attended classes and religious rites with superhuman effort. Her hands trembled while writing, her knees hurt when kneeling, but she never complained. A nun once said, "Bernadette suffers like one who prays." Pressures also mounted on her family. Her parents were summoned by authorities, journalists, and bishops. They wanted them to force their daughter to deny what she had seen. Her father, Francois, a simple and hard-working man, began to feel lost. Her mother, Louise, wept as she embraced her daughter at night, asking her to endure everything with courage. And Bernadette, even while weakened, reassured both with a calm smile. There were days when she took refuge alone at the back of the church in Lourdes, where incense still discreetly perfumed the air, mingled with the sound of quiet footsteps on the stone floor. There before the altar, Bernadette cried, but it was not despair, it was longing. She missed the lady, she missed the light, she missed that supernatural peace that had enveloped her for weeks and now seemed distant, not from absence, but from mystery. The greatest pain, however, was the weight of silence. Everyone wanted answers, explanations, justifications, but Bernadette had nothing more to say. The message had already been delivered. The lady had already spoken, and now it was time to bear the cross of testimony, the hardest cross of all, that of living in the world after touching heaven. She did not rebel, nor did she protest. She simply followed. Like Mary after Calvary, she kept everything in her heart. And while Lourdes transformed into a sanctuary visited by thousands, the little messenger was increasingly pushed towards forgetfulness, illness, and solitude. But there was a profound mystery there. The more forgotten and slandered Bernadette became, the more her soul shone. Because what sustained her faith was not the miracle, nor the fame, but the silent love of a mother who had looked at her like no one ever had. Chapter 6. The Church's acceptance and the construction of the sanctuary. Time passed, but the echo of the apparitions did not fade. Lourdes, once forgotten on maps, began to receive caravans of the faithful. They arrived by carts, on horseback, on foot. Elderly people with canes, women with veils over their heads, men with rosaries in their pockets, and hope in their eyes could be seen. The spring discovered by Bernadette had become a source of faith and living water. Meanwhile, within ecclesiastical walls, something equally silent and solemn was happening. The church began its official investigation. The local bishop, Dom Bertrand Sévère Laurence, an austere and cautious man, gathered theologians, doctors, and scientists to analyze every detail of the case. It was a rigorous process. The aim was not to promote the extraordinary, but to protect the truth of faith against any deception or superstition. At the same time, Bernadette continued her life far from applause. She spent her days between basic studies with the Sisters of Charity and simple care for children and the sick. She never sought out the bishops, never requested an audience, but she was called discreetly to give her testimony before the clergy. She was heard by wise men, doctors, and experienced individuals, and she left the same impression on all. The girl was honest, serene, and firm as the rock of the grotto. No contradiction, no hesitation. When asked if she could be mistaken, she replied, "I know what I saw." In the spring of 1862, 4 years after the first apparition, the silence was broken by a decree that would reverberate throughout France. We believe that the Immaculate Mary, Mother of God, truly appeared to Bernadette Soubirous. The Church officially recognized the apparitions of Lourdes. It was like a torrent of light. The sanctuary began to be built right there, on the rock of Massabielle. A small chapel was erected first, following the request of the lady. Then came the basilicas, the corridors, the fountains, the places for confession, and, above all, the procession, the one the Virgin had requested on March 2nd. The candles began to illuminate the nights. Thousands came to pray. Faith manifested itself in tears, healings, and silent conversions. But Bernadette was not among the pilgrims. She did not mingle with the crowds. She didn't even like to visit the grotto. When questioned about it, she replied with piercing humility, "The grotto is not for me, it is for others." Upon learning of the construction of the sanctuary, she did not show any euphoria. She maintained a serene gaze. What mattered to her was having obeyed. The rest was God's work. While many wanted to turn her into a symbol, she preferred to be forgotten. Father Peyramal, now convinced and moved, became her defender. But even he understood. Bernadette did not belong to Lourdes. She belonged to the silence of God. In the heart of the city, as the sanctuary grew and the candles multiplied in the hands of the faithful, the girl who saw the Virgin was maturing spiritually, in silence, in pain, and in forgetfulness. And then, with a discreet desire, she expressed her wish. She wanted to enter a convent. She sought neither comfort nor recognition. She wanted a cell, a cross, and a rule. She wanted to serve like Mary, hidden and faithful. This was the call. She heard when the lady looked at her in the grotto, a call not to glory but to surrender. Lourdes now belonged to the world, but Bernadette belonged solely to heaven. Chapter 7. The Entrance into the Convent of Nevers. It was the summer of 1866 when Bernadette Soubirous, then 22 years old, climbed the hill of Massabielle for the last time. She stopped in front of the grotto. The sanctuary was already under construction, the corridors were taking shape, and the fountains were gushing vigorously. The crowds were growing. Pilgrims came from all over France and even from other countries. Her name was already circulating among the devotees as a symbol of miracle. But on that day, Bernadette was alone. She knelt on the still, damp earth of the morning and, with her hands clasped, said goodbye in silence. She asked for nothing. She said nothing. She simply looked at the dark stone where she had seen the lady so many times. A gentle breeze blew, and she felt deep down that the time of Lourdes had come to an end. It was time to disappear, like Mary after the resurrection, silent, faithful, withdrawn. The following month, she boarded a train heading north to France, toward the city of Nevers, where the congregation of the Sisters of Charity of Nevers was located. The journey lasted days, through dry landscapes and stuffy stations. Bernadette did not complain. She simply prayed. Upon arriving at the convent, she was received with contained joy by the sisters, but not as a celebrity. There, she was just another novice, and this deeply delighted her. On her very first day, she was directed to the simple cell where she would live. A small room with an iron bed, a wooden cross on the wall, and a crucifix beside it. The smell of melted wax and washed clothes filled the air. Bernadette took a deep breath. She was home. That same week, she received her religious name, Sister Marie Bernard. It was a new birth. From then on, she left behind the seer of Lourdes and embraced a hidden life governed by obedience, silence, and daily sacrifice. The grey habit, the veils, the rules, all of these were dear to her because they pointed to a deeper path, that of radical surrender to the love of God. But convent life was not easy. The sisters had strict schedules, heavy work, and constant prayers. Bernadette, with her fragile health, faced difficulties from the start. Besides asthma, which suffocated her on humid nights, she began to experience intense pain in her bones and fevers that consumed her little by little. Still, she insisted on serving. She helped in the infirmary, cared for the sick, washed utensils, cleaned corridors, always with a shy smile and a peace that disarmed. There was a certain discomfort among the religious with Bernadette's presence. Some expected miracles, others treated her with severity, perhaps to test her. One sister, bothered by the novice's fame, even said, Why did the Virgin choose you, so insignificant?" Bernadette responded sweetly. "The lady looked at me like a mother looks at a child that no one notices." This humility disarmed them. It was not a theological response. It was a response of the soul. And Bernadette, little by little, was winning. The silent respect of all, not for speeches, but for her constancy in pain. One of the tasks that fell most to her was caring for the dying. She would sit beside the beds, hold cold hands and murmur prayers. She would gently wipe the sweat of death away. During one of these visits, she heard from a dying patient, "You look like an angel." She smiled and replied, "I am just a servant." Even as her health deteriorated rapidly, she never asked for attention. She hid her pain, offering it in silence. When asked by a sister why she suffered so much, she replied with tear-filled eyes, "The cross is the gift the Lord left me. I embrace it with love." The convent of Never was thus becoming a new Calvary, not of visible physical martyrdom, but of total surrender. Bernadette did not seek recognition. She did not ask for reminders of Lourdes. On the contrary, she once stated, "I was like a broom. The Virgin used me and then put me behind the door." There was no bitterness in that phrase. There was gratitude, because all she wanted was to love, serve, and disappear, as true saints do. And veiled in simplicity, the scent of medicines and nightly prayers, Bernadette's soul was being shaped like a diamond hidden in the mud. Lourdes was in the hands of the Church, but the heart of the Mother of Heaven continued to watch over her. Now within the walls of Nevers, where silence spoke louder than 1,000 miracles. Chapter 8. The illness, the cross, and the serene death. The convent of Nevers grew quieter. With each passing year, the cold walls and long corridors became increasingly familiar to Sister Marie Bernard, as Bernadette was called. But there was something in the air, in the gestures, in the unspoken words that announced the flower was wilting on the outside but blooming on the inside. Bernadette's health was rapidly deteriorating. The asthma that had accompanied her since childhood was now worsening, with nighttime attacks that left her breathless, suffocated, with a burning chest. Bone tuberculosis had struck her right leg, causing excruciating pain that spread through her joints. The sisters found her curled up on the bed, with her eyes closed and hands clasped, murmuring prayers between groans. She never asked for relief. On the contrary, she said, "Jesus sends me every drop of suffering. I receive it as a kiss." During the winter of 1878, her condition worsened. The fever would not relent. Her body, too thin, could no longer withstand even the slightest effort. The convent doctor, after examining her visibly swollen and deformed bones, murmured, "She carries a pain that would kill 3 men." Even so, Bernadette did not give in to despair. In her simple cell, the crucifix on the wall was her only comfort. She spent hours with her eyes fixed on it. And when asked what she saw, she replied, "I see love. He knows how much it cost me and yet asks for more. How can I not give?" In her last months, she was transferred to the permanent infirmary of the convent. There, the smell of medicines, alcohol, and herbs heated over coal filled the air. The sheet covering her was changed carefully, as even the slightest touch caused pain. The sisters whispered prayers, and she, with an increasingly weak voice, joined them. On clearer days, she asked to hear the lives of saints, especially those who had suffered in silence, like Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, and the Cure of Ars. In the early hours of April 16, 1879, Bernadette felt that the end was near. She asked to kiss the crucifix. Her hands trembled, her eyes filled with tears, but not from fear, from love, from longing for the Mother of Heaven. She sweetly repeated, "I haven't seen the lady since that day, but I have always felt her gaze upon me." At 3 p.m. the convent bell rang softly. The open windows let in the scent of the spring that was beginning. Bernadette, now too weak to move, murmured her last words. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for me, a poor sinner." Her body relaxed. Her face softened. A tear slowly rolled down the corner of her eye, like a farewell between heaven and earth. The nurse holding her hand said afterward, "She left as if she were falling asleep while listening to a song." The convent fell into deep silence. The sisters knelt around her bed. The afternoon light tinted the stone floor in gold. A peace enveloped the room. And in that small cell, without glory, without songs, without crowds, a saint was born for eternity. Her body was buried in the convent garden. Years later, when exhumed, it was found incorrupt, as if time dared not touch such a pure soul. Since then her body rests in a crystal reliquary in the chapel of Nevers, still with a serene face, hands clasped, and a slight smile on her lips. And Lourdes, the town she left behind, became a land of miracles, healings, reconciliations, tears, and conversions. But Bernadette wanted to be forgotten, and that is why God exalted her. Before we pray, imagine yourself inside, a silent chapel. The air is scented with light incense, like sacred mist rising towards the heavens. Outside, the wind whispers through the trees. Inside, the sound of wood creaking, candles crackling on the altar, and the soft squeak of a bench, where a lady kneels with the rosary between her trembling fingers. The light filters through the stained glass, coloring the cold stone floor. There, before the image of the Virgin Mary, we place our hearts and invoke with faith, Saint Bernadette, girl with humble eyes and wounded knees, you who saw heaven. Tear open in the cold stone cave, come to us, weary from the hardships of life, and show us the way of silent hope. You who carried the cross of misunderstanding, of the illness that consumes, and of unjust forgetfulness, teach us to transform our pains into offerings, our tears into prayers, our poverty into altars. Saint Bernadette, you who were chosen by Mary, not for your knowledge, but for your simplicity, help us to empty our hearts of the vanities of the world and make room for the gaze of the Mother of God. Grant us your patience in hidden sufferings, your firmness in the face of persecution, your unwavering faith in the silence of God. You who did not seek applause, nor healings, nor glory, intercede for us in moments when faith falters, when fatigue robs us of prayer, and when we feel forgotten, even by God. Saint Bernadette, cold nights, pains in the body, endless interrogations, and yet your soul remained at peace, because you knew that the lady's gaze was worth more than the whole world. Help us to recognize that gaze upon our lives. Help us to accept that even when heaven is silent, Mary is present, watching over each step, waiting for our yes. We pray for our families, our sick, our children. We pray for those who cry alone and for those who have lost their faith, and for us who so need to learn to love as you loved, in silence, in offering, in truth. Saint Bernadette, accompany us with your intercession so that one day we too may look upon the crucified with your eyes, full of pain, yes, but above all, full of love. Amen.